In the annals of economic warfare, there are calculated strikes, and then there are catastrophic backfires. What unfolded in the United States throughout 2025 belongs firmly in the second category. It was supposed to be the kill shot, a definitive, overwhelming trade maneuver designed to finally bring the Canadian lumber industry to its knees after decades of friction. Washington rolled out its heaviest artillery, confident that it could punish its northern neighbor into submission. But instead of a victory lap, the American capital is currently in a state of chaos. The strategy hasn't just failed. It has reversed course with the violence of a boomerang, striking the very heart of the U.S. economy. A combination of a brilliant, asymmetric legal strategy from Ottawa and a perfect storm of global economic forces has turned Washington's ultimate weapon into a dud. Even worse, it has ignited a fire in America's own backyard, throwing the housing market into turmoil and pitting powerful U.S. industries against one another in a civil war of lobbying and recrimination. This is not just a story about 2x4s and plywood. It is a story about hubris, unintended consequences, and a colossal own goal that has left American policymakers scrambling for answers. How did a plan to protect American sawmills end up devastating American homebuilders? How did a massive new tax result in stable prices? And how did Canada, facing an existential economic threat, manage to outmaneuver the world's largest superpower without firing a single retaliatory shot at the border? To understand the magnitude of this blunder, we have to peel back the layers of the Great Lumber War of 2025. To truly grasp the events of 2025, you have to understand that the US and Canada have been locked in a bitter, on-again, off-again cage match over wood for nearly 40 years. This is the forever war of North American trade. The core of the conflict is a fundamental disagreement about how capitalism should work in the forest. The American argument, unchanged since the Reagan administration in the 1980s, is that Canada is cheating. In the United States, most timber is harvested from private land. Lumber companies have to bid for that wood on the open market, paying whatever price the market dictates. It is a system of pure, often volatile, competition. In Canada, the system is radically different. Most timber is grown on Crown land, land owned by the provincial governments. The government sets the price, called the stumpage fee, that companies pay to harvest trees. U.S. producers have long argued that these stumpage fees are set artificially low, effectively acting as a massive government subsidy that allows Canadian mills to flood the U.S. market with cheap wood that American companies simply cannot compete with. Canada has always shot back that their system is not unfair, just different, and that U.S. producers are simply inefficient and looking for protectionism. This philosophical dispute has led to a cycle of temporary peace treaties followed by brutal trade wars. But what happened in 2025 was not just another skirmish. It was a declaration of total economic conflict. Frustrated by the resilience of Canadian producers, the U.S. Department of Commerce decided that standard measures were no longer enough. They needed a nuclear option. The offensive began in earnest in the summer of 2025. The U.S. Department of Commerce, signaling that the gloves were coming off, decided to more than double the existing duties on Canadian softwood lumber. The first blow landed on July 25, 2025, when the Commerce Department issued its final ruling on anti-dumping duties. They formally declared that Canadian lumber was being dumped into the U.S. market at below-market rates. The penalty was severe. The rate for most companies was jacked up to over 20% overnight. But that was just the jab. Weeks later, Commerce dropped the hammer, countervailing duties. These are taxes specifically designed to offset the alleged unfair subsidies of the Canadian stumpage system. When combined, the total tax burden on Canadian softwood lumber skyrocketed from a manageable 14% to a crushing 35% in the span of a single summer. But Washington wasn't finished. In a move that shocked trade experts and enraged allies, the White House announced a third layer of attack using a controversial tool known as Section 232. This is a provision of trade law that allows the president to restrict imports if they are deemed a threat to national security. Usually reserved for things like steel for tanks or aluminum for jets, the administration argued that a dependence on Canadian lumber was a security risk. On October 14, 2025, a new 10% global tariff on softwood lumber went into effect under the banner of national security. Do the math: 35% in duties plus 10% in security tariffs. Any Canadian producer trying to sell a truckload of spruce to a builder in Texas was now facing a combined tax rate approaching 45%. The aggression didn't stop at raw materials. The Section 232 action also targeted finished goods, slapping a 25% tariff on kitchen cabinets and upholstered wooden furniture. The administration even scheduled these rates to jump to 50% and 30% respectively on January 1, 2026. Although a last-minute delay pushed that specific deadline to 2027, the message was crystal clear. This was a full-scale economic assault designed to wipe Canadian competitors off the map. The U.S. Lumber Coalition, the powerful lobby group representing American sawmills, cheered the move. They believed that with a 45% tax wall, Canadian wood would vanish, supply would tighten, and domestic prices and profits would shoot through the roof. But that is not what happened. In fact, the exact opposite occurred. The first problem was a tactical phenomenon that market analysts are now calling the wall of wood. Canadian lumber producers are not naive. They saw the political winds shifting in Washington months in advance. They knew the tariff hike was coming. So they did the only logical thing a business under siege would do. They emptied their yards. In the months leading up to the July and October deadlines, Canadian mills ran at full capacity, shipping as much wood as they possibly could across the border before the new rates kicked in. They absolutely flooded the American market. Warehouses, distribution centers, and lumber yards from Seattle to Boston were suddenly overflowing with pre-tariff Canadian spruce, pine, and fir. This created a massive artificial supply buffer right at the moment the tariffs were supposed to create scarcity. The American market was awash in wood. The weapon that Washington had spent months designing was neutralized before it was even fully deployed. But the wall of wood was only half the story. The real disaster was brewing in the broader economy. While trade negotiators were fighting over tariffs, the U.S. Federal Reserve was fighting its own war against inflation. Throughout 2025, the Fed's weapon of choice was interest rates. In a relentless campaign to cool the economy, they jacked up rates to levels not seen in decades. These rate hikes hit the U.S. housing market like a sledgehammer. Mortgage rates soared, and suddenly, the dream of owning a home was pushed out of reach for millions of middle-class Americans. The monthly payment on a standard 30-year mortgage nearly doubled for new buyers. Demand for new houses, which had been red-hot, turned ice-cold almost overnight. This is where the U.S. strategy fell apart. When people stop building houses, they stop buying the main thing houses are made of: lumber. So, picture the scenario in late 2025. U.S. sawmills, who had begged for these tariffs, were expecting a market starved of supply where they could charge a premium. Instead, they were hit from both sides. On the supply side, the market was flooded with the wall of wood from Canada. On the demand side, the housing market had cratered due to interest rates. Lumber prices didn't spike. They went into freefall. The second half of 2025 was marked by major market disruptions and incredibly weak demand. It was a nightmare scenario for domestic producers. The tariffs didn't protect them. They just added chaos to a collapsing market. Faced with an economic attack of this magnitude, a near 45% tax on a primary export, the standard response in international relations is tit for tat. You hit my lumber, I hit your dairy. You tax my steel, I tax your bourbon. But Canada threw the standard playbook right out the window. In a masterclass of asymmetric warfare, Ottawa chose not to get into a messy public tariff brawl. While they kept some old retaliatory measures on steel and aluminum in place, they pointedly did not launch a new wave of tariffs over lumber. Instead, Canada's weapon of choice was quiet, methodical, and brutally precise: the law. Specifically, Chapter 10 of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. Chapter 10 is a holdover from the old NAFTA days, a unique dispute settlement mechanism that the U.S. fought hard to remove, but Canada fought harder to keep. It allows an independent, binational panel of experts not American judges, not Canadian judges, but a mixed panel, to review the tariff decisions made by agencies like the U.S. Department of Commerce. It is essentially an international appeal court that checks if the U.S. followed its own laws. Canada has a long, successful history of using this tool. They have repeatedly taken the U.S. to these panels and won, forcing the Commerce Department to recalculate its math and lower the duties. Following the tariff hikes of summer 2025, Canada announced in September that it was officially launching legal challenges under CUSMA Chapter 10 against the new anti-dumping and countervailing duties. This strategy is brilliant for three reasons. First, it moves the fight to a battlefield where Canada has a winning track record. Second, it bypasses the heated, populist rhetoric of the American political system entirely. Third, and most importantly, it weaponizes uncertainty. These legal challenges can take years to resolve. During that time, U.S. companies importing Canadian lumber have to pay the massive tariffs, but they do so knowing that a future ruling could declare those tariffs illegal and force a refund. This injects a slow-acting poison into the market. It makes it impossible for American businesses to plan, forcing them to hedge their bets and keeping the U.S. government on the defensive. The genius of the Canadian strategy is that it lets American domestic politics do the damage for them. The tariffs have created a political civil war in Washington, pitting two of the country's most powerful industries against each other. On one side, you have the U.S. Lumber Coalition. They are doubling down, arguing that the tariffs are essential to fight unfair Canadian trade practices. They are lobbying hard to keep the Section 232 national security tariffs in place, dismissing claims that they hurt housing affordability as misinformation spread by foreigners. They are even attacking the CUSMA panel system itself, arguing it is unconstitutional, a sign of just how much they fear the legal challenge. On the other side, you have the National Association of Homebuilders. For them, the tariffs are an unmitigated disaster. They argue that these duties are artificially driving up construction costs at the worst possible time. With mortgage rates already crushing buyers, the added cost of a lumber tax is the final nail in the coffin for affordable housing. Their plea to the White House is desperate. Stop fighting a trade war and start negotiating a deal. They point out that the U.S. simply does not have enough domestic timber to feed its own construction industry. The U.S. imports about a third of the lumber it uses, and almost all of that comes from Canada. You cannot cut off that supply without creating a shortage. Every 2x4 used to frame a starter home in Ohio or a condo in Florida gets more expensive because of these tariffs. This has left the administration in a bizarre, contradictory position. The Department of Commerce is waging a trade war to protect sawmills, while the White House is desperately trying to solve a national housing crisis that the trade war is making worse. The tariffs are essentially a tax that gets passed on to the American consumer, contradicting the administration's own goals of lowering inflation and helping the middle class. As we move deeper into 2026, the scorecard for the Great Lumber War is becoming clear. By almost any objective measure, Canada is winning. The United States set out to curb Canadian imports, drive up U.S. lumber prices to boost domestic profits, and force Canada to change its timber pricing system. It has failed on every count. The massive tariffs were rendered useless by the wall of wood and the collapse in housing demand. Entering 2026, lumber prices were stable but flat, a crushing disappointment for the tariff supporters who promised a boom. Meanwhile, Canada played its hand perfectly. It didn't panic. It didn't get dragged into a retaliatory spiral. It let market forces neutralize the American attack and moved the substantive fight to the quiet, technocratic corridors of international law where it holds the advantage. A massive showdown is now set for later this year. On July 1st, 2026, the United States, Mexico, and Canada are scheduled to begin a joint review of the entire CUSMA trade agreement. You can bet your life savings that the lumber tariffs and the dispute panels will be at the very top of the agenda. In the end, this saga serves as a powerful lesson in the law of unintended consequences. By trying to build a protective wall around one specific industry, Washington ended up taking a wrecking ball to its own housing market, creating political chaos and getting completely outmaneuvered by a neighbor who refused to blink. The United States may have fired the first shot, but in the complex game of global trade, it was Canada that landed the slam. What is your take on this trade debacle? Is this a case of brilliant Canadian strategy, a massive American own goal, or just the unavoidable messiness of international commerce? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to stay ahead of the curve on the big economic and geopolitical stories that are shaping our world, from trade wars to market crashes, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Liking and sharing this video helps the channel a ton. Thanks for watching.